This is the Tulsa World Newsroom podcast. My name is Jason Collington. I'm the editor of the Tulsa World. I'm here with Andrea Eger, one of our best investigative journalists, and I would argue one of the best investigative journalists working in America today. She has been all over a story for years and years now concerning Epic charter schools, and was able to break some news recently. And I'm here to kind of get the story behind the story. This is where I interview the reporters, photographers, and editors of the Tulsa World and try to bring you what it is that we're really trying to do here at the Tulsa World. Andrea, last week you were at a meeting, the only reporter at a meeting at the Capitol. Tell us what happened.
Well, two education committees on the House side of the legislature, so the House Common Education Committee and the Appropriations and Budget Subcommittee on Common Ed, met jointly and invited our state auditor, our statewide elected auditor, to give them an update on her investigative audit into Epic, which she completed the first round of in October of 2020. That audit was done at the request of Governor Kevin Stitt.
And the headline that we wrote, we put on that story, was that what she has found isn't a small thing. What did she tell them?
Well, she told them that she found that two things primarily, that Epic's for-profit management company, it's called Epic Youth Services. It was founded by the same men who founded the school. So at the same time they found a school, and they established a for-profit school management company at that time exclusively for the management of Epic charter schools. And they appoint their friends to a governing board. These are the auditor's words. And that board approves a management contract with this company, and they pay themselves with board approval 10% of every dollar that comes into the school. That's state, federal revenue, all taxpayer dollars. And it's interesting. It's a question I and others had asked for years, how it could be 10%, because a school of Epic size by law in our state is limited to spending 5% of its revenues on administrative costs. And that's to keep overhead costs down and more money going into the classrooms in public schools in our state. And I never got an answer, and no one I know who asked ever got a clear answer about that. But the auditor said it is clear that they were capped at 5%, and they should have been penalized every year they exceeded that 5% cap, dollar for dollar, meaning paid the state back dollar for dollar, every dollar that they exceeded that 5% cap. But also about that pot of money, the auditor said that she found falsified invoices that the company used to justify those administrative costs. So they couldn't just take 10%. They had to justify what good and service they were being paid for. And she says that there are falsified invoices. The example she gave, the lawmakers are claiming public employees' salaries. The school employed administrators, a whole administrative staff. And the auditor's contention is that they could not claim those salaries. They should not have been claiming child nutrition costs at an online school, for example, on these invoices. And she said she turned those over as evidence to the Attorney General's office. She said evidence of embezzlement. The other pot of money that our auditor has questioned the use of, and this again is all taxpayer dollar, is what Epic has always called the Learning Fund. So they allocate, in the early days of the school, they allocated $800 per student. In the last 3, 4, 5 years, that was increased to $1,000 per student. That covers the cost of a laptop or an iPad if they need one, the basic cost of their curriculum, a couple $100. And then the parents have a say for the Epic one-on-one students in how the rest of that money is spent. Well, the auditor found that all of that money was shifted over to the private company. And that finding was confirmation of the Tulsa World's own reporting We had done a records request and demonstrated through those records that we obtained that this public company was taking all of that taxpayer money into the private company for their management. And they would never provide documentation to us of how they were spending it on students. Well, they also wouldn't provide that documentation to the state auditor in this state. And so with the Attorney General's help, she took them to court. She took the private management company to court. And what she told the lawmakers last week is that that lawsuit has given her some private behind closed doors access to some records, which she found showed that this money was all taken into private business accounts. It was never accounted for back to the school, apparently, and that many of the expenditures were being made on personal credit cards. And so she still has not been able to account for how much was spent on students. And she said to the lawmakers last week that she has never been able to get a final ruling from an Oklahoma County District judge on making those records public and getting full access to them. So it was very interesting.
And I mean, the headline, this might be one of the biggest cases of stolen taxpayer money in Oklahoma history.
She did say that. I had never heard her say that or anybody say that, but the numbers in question are very high. And I had personally wondered how this compared to, historical things that, we hear about, the Oklahoma County Commissioner scandal of the 80s, which was, well before my time working as a journalist. And, but she told the lawmakers that 10% cut, the falsified invoices, she believes is as high as $53.5 million out of the $68 million that they were paid for 5 or 6 years. And obviously they were paid for years before that, but her audit only goes back to 2015. And she said, that the inaction by lawmakers last session after her audit came out and inaction by law enforcement had allowed this company to, in her words, siphon off up to another $80 million that she said is unaccounted for.
I mean, she even brought up Enron in her discussion. I mean, tell us the context of that statement.
Yeah, she said that this arrangement, which is not unique to Epic, but it is possibly why, there are so many examples around the country. She told lawmakers about 3 recent ones of financial wrongdoing being prosecuted. There are examples of this around the country, she told them, but she used that phrase, the Enron of public ed, about this arrangement of, someone setting up a public school and then setting up a side-by-side for-profit venture to, in her words, milk taxpayer profits, to milk the school for profits. And, it's an interesting question, how much profit margin could be made in public education or in education of pre-K through 12th grade students. And, what that margin should be, what is a reasonable leftover margin to be made as profit after you pay for the education of children, which is not cheap.
And for people who don't know what Epic Charter Schools, they were a charter school that started and during the pandemic became the largest school district in Oklahoma.
Yes.
And they've kind of trailed off a little bit. The enrollment has kind of come down. But this is a program that was in many counties. Many Oklahoma children were going to this school. And now, and as you reported, there's a chance that this setup gave the founders of this charter school, it could be said that they've become millionaires because of this arrangement and the way the system was set up. Well, what's the latest now? So your story comes out, makes news, shared all over the internet, many of the private groups on Facebook that are focused on education, a lot of discussion based on your reporting. What's the latest right now that we're about a week away from that story?
Well, yeah, and that was a big story because after listening to the auditor speak to these lawmakers, it raised the question in my mind again of, what is the status of this? She made very pointed remarks to them, as she did in November when she spoke to a Tulsa County GOP women's luncheon gathering, that she doesn't know why charges haven't been filed in this case. Just as a reminder, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation has been investigating on and off reports of wrongdoing or questions about how taxpayer money is being spent by Epic since 2013. It's a really long time. And, we documented through our reporting in the first half of 2019 that that investigation had been revived, and also that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Department of Education's law enforcement arm had also joined in the years leading up to that report. So 2017, 2018, this thing got going again. And so when the auditor said, I don't know why nothing has been done, I picked up the phone that afternoon before I sat down to write my story, and I called the OSBI, asked for a status report. I called the Attorney General's office and asked for a status report. The AG's office said they could not comment on an ongoing investigation, but the OSBI said they answered that they had turned over their case, that their investigation had been completed, and that they had turned the case over to the Attorney General's office for their review. That was news, and it was big news. And so, yeah, we got a pretty big headline out of a couple of phone calls in the afternoon. And then at the end of the week, the Attorney General's office announced that it was not going to ultimately decide whether or not charges should be filed, that would be back in the hands of Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater. Prater oversaw the case, if you could call it that. I mean, obviously law enforcement works hand in hand between the investigators and, the individuals who decide whether or not to pursue charges in a case like that. And again, that case was on and off for those years, but the Attorney General's office took the case and appointed a special prosecutor in late 2020. And here, just over a year later, the Attorney General's office handed that case back to the Oklahoma County District Attorney, David Prater, and he will ultimately decide whether or not charges should be pursued against the founders of Epic and the for-profit operators of that management company and their employees.
You also mentioned that the IRS is now involved too. What's going on with the IRS?
Yeah, it was just a little mention during the meeting with lawmakers that the auditor made. Epic has had some dramatic change occur in the last 7 or 8 months. At the end of May, there was a dramatic shift in the leadership of the school board, and an overhaul. Some new members have been added in recent months. And the new governing board chair, whose name is Paul Campbell, he's a businessman from the Seminole area. He runs a charter school in Seminole, Oklahoma. He was sitting in the room, and our auditor looked over at him and said to the lawmakers, oh, by the way, Mr. Campbell just told me that Epic Charter Schools has just been notified by the IRS that it is under federal audit. And apparently that was welcomed by the school. The new leadership has invited in the OSBI and apparently federal investigators for a couple of months now. They announced that in December themselves. So the new leadership of the school is trying to, clean house and make sure that things are done properly moving forward to, keep the school in operation. You mentioned that the enrollment was up and then back down. It's still a very, very large school district. So, enrollment did peak at about 60,000 students during the pandemic as parents all over the world really sought at home, remote learning options. And Epic certainly is a big brand name in our state for that service. And but by this last fall, by the fall of 2020, their enrollment had declined down to, I believe, around 35,000 students total. But it's still one of the largest school systems in our state as it stands.
So you and I have known each other a long time. We met back in college, and we both interned at the Oklahoman. And then I came to the Tulsa world, and then you came to the Tulsa world. And one of the first jobs that you had is that you became the beat writer on education, and kind of became, again, like you always have, rose to the top of being the top education reporter in the state, and did a lot of reporting. When did Epic first get on your radar? What year was it? Take me back to that day when you first heard the word Epic Charter School.
I have had, occasion to think about that moment a lot the last few years. This last month, the end of January, marks 3 years that, Epic has been the primary focus of my reporting. And I've never worked on any one subject matter that long. I covered Tulsa Public Schools and the local school board there for 17 years, but the focus of our reporting on that was completely varied, from one day to the next. But when these co-founders of Epic, their names are David Cheney and Ben Harris, were getting started, it was this very new thing, online virtual schooling. And the state superintendent at the time was named Sandy Garrett. And I had just begun covering the State Board of Education. So this would have been in the 2009-2010 range. And, virtual schooling online on a computer at home schooling was in its infancy in our state. And these guys emerged on that scene with this idea. And I actually attended a meeting here in Tulsa that David Cheney hosted at a rec center / childcare kind of facility that was vacant. And it was a meeting in the evening, a public meeting. And I just sat in the background and thought, I'm going to go listen to what this guy's saying about this new thing. And he was trying to sell parents on the idea of Epic, but he had this idea that they needed to offer an in-person option for students that was unheard of at the time for virtual schooling. It was meant to, at that time, to be this alternative, for people who were homeschool minded, or who had sick kids, or who had kids who were gymnasts and training for things that, child actors and that sort of thing.
Right,
and
right.
So it was really interesting. And, you don't always remember, especially when you cover education, you cover a lot of meetings, you sit through a lot of informational sessions for parents. And, but it really jumped out at me that they had this idea and they were telling these parents, don't worry, if you want to do this, we'll have this place where you can drop your child off during the day. Their learning would still be based on a computer, but you'll have this place to bring them. Well, it turned out that the state superintendent who had just taken over, her name was Janet Barisi, had other ideas about the legality of that, and it landed them in court. So the State Department of Ed at that time, under Janet Barisi's leadership, ended up in court with Epic, and they weren't allowed to open those physical locations. So those parents at that meeting I attended, they didn't have a place to drop their kids off. The idea evolved over the years. Legislation was brought and passed, and that idea of a physical location came back in, for Epic in 2017. They opened what they call Epic Blended Learning Centers in Tulsa and Oklahoma County. And in 2018, I went to visit the new Tulsa Blended Learning Center for Epic. And it was the same. It was that idea that I had heard pitched 8-9 years earlier, this place where you can come and bring your kids if you work or whatever. And it would be online computer-based learning. There would be teachers sort of roaming the room to assist as needed, but and your child could, have a place to go if you couldn't stay home with them or felt that they needed that kind of support and assistance of a teacher on site. And that really is what is how we got involved in our reporting in early 2019. So EPIC started growing by leaps and bounds when that idea came into play over 2017 and 2018. And they dangled this carrot. They used that $1,000 or $800 learning fund for parents and their ability to direct some of it to pay for activities for students like horseback riding or acrobatic lessons and piano lessons and soccer clubs, to use whatever was left over of that as they saw fit for their child. And so the charge to me by our bosses at the time was, where's all of this money going? Right. How could they have that much left over after spending on the education of students, and find out where that money's going?
What would you say this investigation has taught you? I mean, you've done a lot of things, dug into a lot of things, but like you said, this is the longest story you've worked on. What have you learned from it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've thought a lot about, having been an education reporter this long. It has its advantages, but I think you also, it has its disadvantages. And one thing that really jumps out at me is, that I think that we as education reporters need to better inform and educate the public about the limitations of the annual auditing process that public schools in our state undergo. I've thought a lot about how long this investigation has gone on, how long these founders of EPIC were able to get by and keep operating and to have these questions asked, but never really answered. And one of the responses that they gave for many years was, our audits are clean, our audits are clean. And our state auditor, who's elected by the taxpayers, has said repeatedly in public since her report came out on October 1st of 2020, that those audits don't work that way. They're not investigative in any fashion. They're balance sheet, they're statement audits. So they're making sure that the numbers balance out of the money coming in and the money going out, and that they haven't gone into the red. They're not investigative audits. And, last week she told the lawmakers who asked her, how has this been investigated for so long and nothing happened? She also noted to them that she doesn't believe the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation even has a forensic auditor on staff. And it just was a really interesting point. Yeah. She said she has 100 auditors on staff, and her agency budget is around $10 million. I think a lot of people felt assured that things were okay when, according to our state auditor, maybe they weren't. Second, before I go, there was one other thing I thought of about, as a lesson from this, and that's, there are fewer journalists in our state working today. The media landscape is very changed, but I think journalists need to devote more of our limited resources on scrutinizing new uses of public money, particularly as government pushes into new areas of privatization. And that's really what the story is about. The EPIC co-founders told lawmakers and investigators and the public for a decade that they were just doing this new thing, and that was the answer to why people were going after them. But again, according to our state auditor, according to some search warrant affidavits that have come out through the course of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation's probe into this, the allegation is that there was just good old-fashioned, misuse of taxpayer alleged in this case. And, you know, that's not new. That's, you know, not something that should happen just because there's something new being tried or a private entity is the one handling taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, I think our state has gone into some new areas over the last couple of years, and you're right. Sometimes laws are written, sometimes policies are put into place, sometimes a system's put into place, and there's not a lot of, does this even work? How can someone turn this evil? How can someone turn this into a profit-making machine? That things are not fully thought out before they're proposed, before they're signed by the governor, before they are approved by both, you know, houses of the legislature. So yeah, you're right. This is a kind of a look into what happens when not every question is answered, and what going with something new that again, other states have charter schools. Other states have had charter schools for a long time, but it seems like the way that we did it has created this system that our state auditor says might be the biggest embezzlement of taxpayer dollars in our history. So, Andrea, I appreciate all the work you've done on this. You continue to be on this. As said, you were the only reporter in that meeting when you broke that story of the auditor talking to those two subcommittees. This is what we do here. You know, we take our reporters and photographers and we send them places you can't go, and we go to places that you need to be at. And so, Andrea, appreciate all the work on it. Again, this podcast is a chance for me to talk to the reporters, photographers, and editors of the Tulsa World and try to get the stories behind the stories. Reminder, this is a podcast you can subscribe to, just like all 8 of the Tulsa World podcasts are. They're on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Please subscribe today and follow the stories of the Tulsa World. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
For more information, you can visit tulsaworld.com.